Jarrell Jackman, it's really great to see you again. It's been too long, and to talk to you about this really interesting book that you've written. I got a copy here with lots of let's see, I'm going to hold it up to the camera. I have lots of post-it notes from things that I wanted to remember by looking at it. But yeah, I'm excited about it and want to talk about it. And maybe as a way of getting started, we can talk a little bit about who you are and the things you've done for the people that didn't listen to the last time we spoke. But there's a bio at the back of the book that I can read from, and then of course you can add anything that you'd like to that's missing. Jarrell C. Jackman holds a Ph.D. in American Cultural History from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He lived, traveled, taught, and did research in Europe for 6 years, especially in Germany and Spain. He was employed by the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation for 35 years, where he served as project administrator and then CEO, and that's what we're going to talk about today. His many honors include recognition by the California State Parks and the California State Parks Rangers Association. For his work on the Santa Barbara Presidio, he was knighted a commander in the Spanish Royal Order of Isabel Católica by King Felipe VI of Spain, which I hope we'll talk about a little bit as well. Author and editor of numerous articles and books, Dr. Jackman has recently completed a manuscript on Norman Neuberg, the mastermind behind the creation of the Getty Villa. Does that sum it up? Is there anything else
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums up. But as you mentioned, we're here today to talk about the Presidio, and the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation was the operator of the state park. That's a unique relationship between California State Parks, the nonprofit, the Santa Barbara Trust, and we also had agreements with the city and the county, and rather complex, but it was a way to get the project advanced. And and there were many different ways that we went about doing it. And I think that's what the book tries to capture, how the Presidio was built originally, the importance of the Presidios, and then trying to bring it back to life in the city of Santa Barbara. And that's a big part of the story, how the trust was able to start rebuilding the Presidio, but it took decades before they could actually get there to do it.
It's quite a story. And, I've visited the Presidio, visited it with my family. It's sort of a jewel of Santa Barbara. There's the mission as well, of course, but it really, if you're in the city, the old city of Santa Barbara, it's really sort of the anchor, and it's an amazing place to visit and see what's been done there, of course, under your supervision. So yeah. I'm wondering if you can we can set a little bit of context here. If you can talk a little bit about Presidios and what they were and why they were so important, and then maybe talk a little bit about this one in Santa Barbara that you brought back to life.
Well, I and many others. Yes. Well, first of all, you realize the American forts in the American West were very critical in the development of the West, in going from east to west, particularly in the 19th century as they crossed the Mississippi River. Well, the Spanish had a somewhat similar situation in that they created these forts called Presidios. Especially, there was a row of forts that went all the way from California out to Texas, starting actually down from Mexico City and moving all the way up finally to Alta California. And as I point out in the book, the very last Spanish Adobe fortress built in North America was our Presidio in Santa Barbara. It was the fourth one in Alta California. And these were really important places for the settlement of the area. After the Presidio was founded in Santa Barbara, the fort was built, but by the end of the Spanish period, 1820, actually, in some ways it was earlier than that because of things that were going on in Europe. But by 1820, the Santa Barbara environment had been really transformed in many ways by the presence of the Spanish with the Presidio and then also with the missions. And what you have to realize is that there were 4 military districts in California: San Diego, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. And each one of those had missions underneath them. And those missions were really under the management in some ways. The priests didn't like to see it that way. They wanted to see themselves more connected to the Franciscan world in Mexico City. But the fact is, they were answerable to the Presidios. And the first permanent settlers of Alta California, obviously the indigenous people were here, were the people that came to the Presidios. And in Santa Barbara, there was a very large contingent of soldiers and their families that came up. And those were the first settlers of the Santa Barbara region. And many of the street names and other named areas are after these soldiers and their families who first came to Santa Barbara in the 1780s. So they're very important for that. The people that came and settled here in the 1780s came from, as I point out, a very diverse background. We're into diversity these days, and we had plenty of it at the Presidio of Santa Barbara. Large population of actual indigenous people from other areas, Indians who were soldiers. Then there were those soldiers who were part Spanish, part Indian, called mestizo. Then there were the mulattoes, that was the term used for the black soldiers, and there was a contingent of almost 20% of the first soldiers in the 1790s, at least the records showed by then. And then very few actual Spaniards. There was only one Spaniard born in the 1790 records that show that he was born in Spain, but he was a servant. All the other people called Spaniards were born in Mexico. So there's that interesting social history that I think is really important, and we've sort of lost sight of that to a degree because of the prominence of the California missions, all 21 of which have been preserved in some fashion, whereas really only the Santa Barbara Presidio has been saved and preserved and has been rebuilt. The others completely disappeared in San Diego. The beautiful churches, the Presidio Church is still there in Monterey. And in San Francisco, they have a few rooms, probably dating from the late Spanish, early Mexican period. So it's kind of a lost period of history that the Santa Barbara Trust and California State Parks have brought back to life. And I think that makes them quite important.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we don't realize, or many people don't realize. And, reading the book, it brought me, and by the way, the title of the book is Santa Barbara's Royal Presidio: The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Spain's Last Adobe Fortress. One of the things that it reminded me of is the fact that it is the only standing Presidio, Spanish Presidio in California that you can enter, look around, see, touch. Whereas exactly, if you go to, San Francisco up until recently was an active military base, and I used to visit it with my uncle who served in the big one. He used to say in World War II, and he used to take me there, but I never had any sort of concept that this was a place that had been around for 200 some odd years. And the same if you go to Monterey, it's still an active military base. If you go to San Diego, as you mentioned, there's a museum up on the Presidio Hill, but there's really no remnants of the Presidio itself. So it is very unique in California, and also the fact of being a non-church. It's not a church. It's a military or non-ecclesiastical place that gives you insight into different aspects of history. So yeah, that's a really interesting aspect. The fact that it's the only one that's standing to this day.
Yeah, and fortunately, Monterey has a small museum. I won't say fortunately. Well, they do have a small museum interpreting the Spanish next to the church, and then the rooms up in San Francisco have been preserved, but and then San Diego, nothing except in the museum, the Serra Museum up above, and they put a few things in there showing some of the archaeology and the people that have worked on it. There's a kind of irony there, in that here's the one Presidio that would have been very easy to rebuild because it's in a park area in San Diego. And then, of course, we chose to rebuild the one that's right in the smack in the middle of the town with two streets, busy streets crossing right through it. But somehow we did it, and they sort of lack the will down in San Diego to do it, although they tried really hard, coming to talk to us many times. And I think I allude to this in the book, but also the Tucson Presidio, that's part of the Spanish world too, out in Arizona. That has rebuilt a section of it based on their coming to California, meeting with us, and then inviting me on a couple of occasions out to Tucson to talk about it. And they actually raised the money in tax dollars to rebuild a section of it. So I think that's really been a good sign, is that the Presidio of Santa Barbara has had an influence in getting that Presidio history more interpreted, both in California and outside in Arizona.
Well, what do you think people, by and large, don't understand about Presidios? Or what do you think? I mean, because as we were talking before we started recording, the part of California's early history that really gets the lion's share of the attention are the missions, right? And of course, there's 21 of them that have been restored, as you mentioned. But what is it about Presidio that what is it about not knowing much about the Presidio element of California history, or better yet, all of northern New Spain, the southwestern United States, that can help us conceptualize better this place that we're in?
Well, that's a pretty intense question. Yeah. Well,
that's what I'm all about.
I alluded to the fact that the Presidios transformed the environment of California, and while you can say the missions did that as well, it was sort of it came from the Presidios itself. The missions were founded, and they had to work with the Presidio commandants whenever they wanted to do something. And so agriculture, domestic animals, etc., all came up from the Spanish, and it was not done by the church people. It was done by the civilian military people who made possible all of this, bringing up the implements for agriculture, driving the animals up from Mexico to get here and so forth. So their influence was very profound. And in California, the naming of various places were after Presidios. I mean, San Diego Presidio, obviously, we mentioned them all, Spanish naming of these places. And it really brought the first immigration from Mexico to here. And it's kind of defined California in some ways. I mean, obviously, immigration is front and center right now. What is it? They're estimating that 5+ million people have crossed the border from Mexico. They've been crossing the border back and forth, but mostly in this direction since the Spanish started coming here actually before California in the 17th century in Mexico. So it's a really very important part of the history that we don't think about. The difference, of course, in the mission is that the Indians were brought to the missions, and in some ways, the Padres weren't here as settlers. Many of them came here and died here. Many of them left and went away. Most of them weren't married, so they didn't perpetuate families. So the California that we know today, this diverse population, really began at these missions. And as you know, that we also had pueblos in San Jose and Los Angeles that were settled by the Spanish as well. And so that is a really important part of the history that we don't know about. And the more we study it, the more we can learn about it. I think we have a larger perspective of this world that we're in today. And I think maybe we have a little more respect because I think, let's be honest, the Spanish are seen as colonists today. They colonized the West and they colonized California, and they did severe damage to the Indian populations here. And there's obviously evidence of that. But there is a difference in the relationship between the indigenous people in California amongst the Spanish missions and the Presidios, and during the gold rush era, as you know. There's really two different worlds. And the Spanish had a little bit different attitude, like quite a bit different attitude towards the native people, to try to make them citizens and become part of the future of the Spanish world. Not successful, but it was an idea at least, and something that really needs to be more appreciated, I think, than it is today.
Yeah, the idea that the diversity of California begins with the Presidios is really fascinating, and it really helps you understand the character of this place and this state and its history. Can you talk? No, go ahead.
Well, I'd also like to mention the uniqueness, and it's in the book, of the situation in Santa Barbara, excuse me, with the Chumash people. This is the only Presidio where it was here before the mission. The Santa Barbara mission, Sarah came, did the founding mass, but he thought he was founding a mission, but that was canceled. And so the Presidio was here with the Indians from 1782 to 1786, and a different kind of relationship developed. And amongst that was the fact that the Indians were left in their village once the Padres got here, and were evangelized in their villages, which was a very unique Enlightenment idea that Governor Navy brought to California. And that didn't really happen elsewhere in California that I know of in the research that I've seen, and gives the California Santa Barbara Presidio a unique flavor that you don't see elsewhere.
So let's talk a little bit about the Santa Barbara Presidio. Can you give us a little bit of a timeline and how and when it was started and what its role was?
Well, they were talking about it for years because Sarah wanted a mission around the Ventura area way back in the early 1770s. But it wasn't until about 80 when they started to get serious about putting a Presidio here, and it was obviously founded later. Let's see, it was April 21st, 1782 when the Presidio was founded. And one of the reasons they wanted a Presidio before the mission was they had the problem at the Colorado River where the soldiers and priests had been attacked by the Indians and slaughtered in some instances, and then some of the Indian women were carried off, and so they were concerned that something like that could happen in California, although there was no evidence of any violence towards the Spanish in California, except down in San Diego a little bit before. But so that was the main reason the Presidio was put down here first, and then the mission would come later. And Sarah died 1784, so he never saw the Santa Barbara mission founded. It was done under La Suen, who became the Padre Presidente of the missions after Sarah. So a lot of different features about the Santa Barbara Presidio that are from the other Presidios, not only in California, but elsewhere. And the very fact that it was the last one. And, I had one historian, Marie Duggan, who said she wonders how things would have worked out at the Presidio of Santa Barbara had things been different elsewhere. For example, the Spanish Empire was about to collapse in 1810. So there's this kind of special relationship that was developing in Santa Barbara by these advanced Chumash Indians and the Spanish, both at the missions and at the Presidios. But it was cut short starting around 1810 when problems started to emerge in Mexico, when an independence movement started to happen. And then, of course, Napoleon's in Europe conquering Spain. And so California is completely neglected and left on its own. And so this world that Marie Duggan said might have developed didn't because of that. And in fact, it went the other direction. It went negative, you might say, so that the Spanish really were, ships stopped coming around 1812, something like that, 1810 to 12. And then by 20, then there was an independence thing, and California was now part of Mexico. So the world had really changed. And when on the negative side, there was a terrible Indian revolt in 1824. And I point out that this didn't happen during the Spanish period. This was during the Mexican period. And I think one of the main reasons was the neglect that had taken place, that Spanish administration had been very aware of relations with Indians, but that had sort of fallen slightly by the wayside, to say the least. So we had the worst Indian revolt in California at Mission San Ynez in 1824. And that spread to the Mission La Parisa and even down to the Santa Barbara Mission. So that part of the history is also very fascinating.
You know, I think you mentioned in the book regarding the Chumash revolt, which is a whole subject in itself that would be really interesting to talk more about. I think you mentioned that one of the things that changed under the new Mexican Republic was that the relationship between soldiers and native people wasn't mediated anymore by officers or by the sort of legal system. And it was more directly, there was just much more direct sort of contact and opportunity for emotions to get out of control, abuse, and things like that. Am I remembering correctly? Is that something that you?
Yes, that's correct. And another thing you can underscore there is the fact that the ships stopped coming, and those ships actually brought the supplies, etc., that were needed in California. So there was a deprivation issue, not only in terms of the Indians, but also for the soldiers themselves. And also the Presidio was dependent on the food supply provided by the missions, and they were putting more pressure on them to increase it. So these are multiple factors that led to the revolt. And obviously there was an act of violence where a soldier actually beat an Indian, and then the Indians revolted. The mission was set on fire, and there were a couple of cases where people were killed, and then the Indians retreated to the Tulare out in the valley, and then De La Guerra put soldiers together, and they eventually put it down. And there were several executions, and others who were put in jail. So it was a full-on revolt. And I do think that the factors that we're talking about here were key in understanding why that revolt happened. I think there was a different relationship. I don't think people talk about the hard labor that was involved in building the Presidio and so forth. But I think there was something going on there. The Indians had a kind of Indian independence. I have a friend who's writing a biography, not a biography, but a history of the Ventura Mission. He's researching it and doing some writing. And he's finding that the Indians in that area, which is part of the Santa Barbara military district, and I don't write about this in the book, but it's important, that there were some independent, there were these villages that were involved with various activities, some growing olive trees, some doing something else. And it's really an interesting part of the story of what might have happened. But again, it didn't happen because of the problems. And then, as you know, the missions are secularized in the 1830s, where the Indians are really thrown out of the missions in some cases, and then they form villages. But that's really the demise, really, of the Indian peoples. I don't want to call it the demise, but something happened there that eventually the Indians, the Chumash, pretty much were not a people separate anymore the way they had been before the Spanish came.
Can you mention or tell us about any particular interesting stories from this Presidio, from its history as a living place?
Yeah,
because I know there's some in the book.
yeah, well, there are, and I won't tell the stories about the legal stories, that even though they're quite fascinating, maybe a tickler to get people to go out and buy the book. But there are some stories of Indians and soldiers put on trial for violent crimes, and people actually, there were two people executed in California for criminal activity, murder, and so forth. And that's an interesting side to the thing. And I always tell people, if you want to get the darker side of early California, go through those legal records, because they give you a lot of details on the people who were put on trial, and actually, in some cases, physical descriptions of the people, which you don't often get. So that's a really good place to go to learn about that side of history. The other incident that, if you read the book, was about the Indian who was the son of Yananali. He was 5 years old, and his name was Juan. He was given the Spanish name of Juan Batista, and he died of unknown causes. And I haven't ever been able to find out if anybody has described how he died of these causes. Probably some kind of disease. I don't know for sure, but Yananali, the chieftain whose village was down near the beach from the Presidio, and Goycochea were pretty good pals. Maybe that's too loose a way to put it, but they had an amicable relationship.
And Goycochea was the Presidio commandant.
Goycochea was the commandant of the Presidio, who was in charge of building it and overseeing matters for 18 years. By the way, he's a very important historical figure that hardly anybody knows about. Everybody knows about De la Guerra or Coda Ortega, and I often think it's because you can't pronounce his name, Goycochea. That's a vast name. But anyway, the son had died, and Goycochea actually had him buried in the Presidio chapel, and there must have been a dirge of some sort, because I know he wouldn't have died in the village because in the Presidio, because the Indians didn't stay in the Presidio. So he had to die in his village and be brought up in some kind of ceremony and buried there. So to me, that was a sign of cooperation between the Chumash, at least between the head of the Chumash, Yananali, and Goycochea, that is not talked about. And something I'm sure, that almost all the Indians were buried in common graves at the mission. So Yananali, after Goycochea left, he goes to the mission, he dies, and he's buried in a common grave, and nobody knows exactly where he's buried among the remains that are there. So that's a story, I think, that emphasizes that there was this special relationship between the Chumash and the Spanish during this period.